This pie chart is a model that we call social movement ecology. And so I'll talk a little bit about that model. That's something that we've developed at the Whirlwind Institute, but my brother Paul has worked closely with Carlos Saavedra at the INE Institute. So INE is another place you can go to find information on this. So we want to definitely give a shout out to Carlos and all the folks at INE who have worked on this. Um, so as I said before, a lot of my work is kind of saying there's no one right way to organize. Social movements are often made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that are coming together, and they're coming together with different perspectives, different organizing traditions, and different theories of change, of how they're going to create change. And a lot of times successful movements combine elements of all of these different traditions. And so that's really important to try to create a healthy ecosystem that draws on these different areas of change. But between these, there's also a lot of conflicts because people come to movements with different conceptions of what they're doing. They're often in tension with one another. And often they don't really even understand that they're doing something different. They don't understand the tradition that they're a part of. People just, are part of a campaign or they're part of an organization. They just say, this is how it's done. And then they're in tension with other people who are doing something different. So this model of what we call social movement ecology is a way of looking at some of these different dominant theories of change that are in play in social movements. So the segment over here of personal transformation, that deals with people who are trying to create change, one individual at a time through education, through therapy, through sometimes through services by providing, charity work, people providing housing, things like that, trying to improve the life of the individual. And also spiritual practices, meditation practices, and things like that. Personal transformation can be an important part of movements, but it can be something that, if it's isolated, becomes just kind of a charity approach or a very modest, kind of individual approach. Alternatives is people who are trying to create different models of ways to live. And that was some of the people I grew up around in the Catholic Worker. They created these radical communities of people who modeled very different, values. This can include worker cooperatives, different ways to do business. It can include countercultural spaces, punk music spaces, feminist bookstores, all of these spaces that people can go to get, different ideas, different theories of how to be in the world. And both of these personal transformation alternatives can be very powerful. And they are sometimes grouped together as what's called prefigurative activism, which is trying to create the world we want to live in, kind of apart from the dominant institutions of society. These other methods are more engaging in the dominant institutions of society and demanding change. So inside game in the United States, this is the most common thing. If you want to create change, you're told to run for public office, to do elections, to hire a lobbyist, to file a lawsuit. All of that is kind of following the rules of the system as it's supposed to be. Structure-based organizing is those unions and community groups that are trying to build up large organizations, build a base of members, and then leverage the power of an organized membership to then affect the political process. And then the last segment we talk about there is mass protest, and that is those movements that can kind of come out of seemingly come out of nowhere sometimes and really change the political landscape through civil disobedience, direct action, through wide scale protests. They can capture the public imagination and change how the public, sees an issue and change what's politically possible around an issue. So all of those things are important. A lot of our writing in our book, This is an Uprising, focused more on mass protest and focused on how mass protest and structure interact and how mass protest influences the inside game. And there's a reason for that, which is that, even though if you say, well, what is a social movement? People think of a big group of people out holding signs and protesting. There isn't actually a lot of understanding of how that works, And in the United States in particular, people are pretty dismissive of protest movements. Oh, they don't do anything, they're not, they should just run for office, they should just engage in elections. And so, our argument is actually partly about the power of those movements, the effects that they do have, and why mass protest movements are, in fact, very powerful. And, as we started to research this, there's a whole tradition, there's a whole literature of this that's evolved in the last 30 years that many of the participants are probably aware of to some extent, which is now a field called civil resistance, which is how do you how do you wage campaigns of escalating nonviolent resistance to leverage, a political result? And in many parts of the world, people use mass protest because, a lot of the other options have been shut down, right? Elections are not an option. You're shut out of the internal mechanisms of control, either because it's an undemocratic regime, or maybe you're, a minority interest that is somehow excluded from formal politics. And armed struggle is off the table because they hold the cards. They're a powerful military force. You're not going to win through waging a guerrilla war. And so people are like, well, what are the other options? What can we do? And the theory of civil resistance has really evolved, looking at a huge number of historical examples, foundational models like the Indian independence movement under Gandhi or the US civil rights movement, but all over the world, looking at Chile in the 80s and 90s, looking at the Philippines, looking at many, many different examples to talk about how people using civil resistance, using these techniques of non-cooperation, of protests, strikes, boycotts, have leveraged that power to unseat, to create social change. That can be to unseat undemocratic regimes, or in more democratic contexts, to take issues that politicians would not touch, that they did not want to talk about, and move them into the center of political discussion and create change around those issues. So those are some of the models that's the model of movement ecology, the framework of social movement ecology that we use to talk about those different theories of change. And so we do, right now, both with the book and with this, talking about this model. I mean, obviously, the book we wrote, whatever it is, 300 pages. So it's hard to say in 5 minutes what is the book about. If I could say it all in 5 minutes, I wouldn't have written the book. And the same thing with movement ecology. We bring people together for 3 or 4 day trainings on these models, so they really think about it. They really relate it to their work. So right now we're only touching the very tip of the iceberg of what you can get into. But, um, you know, we get people talking, creating a framework like this allows people, first of all, to step back from their own work and to say, oh, this is what my organization does, or this is what this is what the movements that I've been a part of. This is kind of their dominant approach. And a lot of people have never thought that way before. They never really compared what they're doing with other people and thought about the strengths and weaknesses of every different model. And sometimes we get people yelling at each other. We get people talking about the tensions. Well, what do you think about this other model? It's like, oh, you guys are sellouts. You guys are just insiders that have no alternative vision, or you guys are irrelevant. You have no way of building political power. You're completely isolated. Or you guys, yeah, well, you can do these big things, but then they disappear, and we're here for the long haul. And those tensions are really powerful because once you can name them and get people talking about it, then you can talk about moving beyond those, right? Then you can talk about, well, how do we actually work together and collaborate? Part of this model is not to, it's to train people how to respond better when opportunities emerge, right? So if we do have a moment, um, you know, we have moments that appear all the time. In the United States, it's happening now around, mass protests against Trump, around, ICE, the immigration protests, places like Minneapolis, where you have mass numbers of people out on the street, getting involved, and there's a tremendous clamor for people to get involved, and it it this should be the dream of every social movement, right? That, 100 people are outside your door saying they want to be involved. And you'd be shocked at how many organizations, for their staff, that's their worst nightmare because they have no ability to absorb those people. They have no ability to actually know what to do with those people who are coming in, right? And so part of what we're doing here is just getting people to think in a way where they're prepared. How do we harness these big moments when they happen? So it's not necessarily, one way to be prepared is is not necessarily to change what your organization is doing, but it's to understand, okay, this is my role, and I'm going to do my role very well. And then I'm going to think when opportunities arise about how can I be a good ally, right? So a union that's a good ally to a protest movement or a structure-based community group, those mass protests may not really be part of their model. But instead of just saying like, oh, we don't believe in that stuff, we're not going to be a part of that, ones that are open to it can do all sorts of things. Well, first of all, they can activate their membership and they can encourage their membership to take part. But they can, do things like, well, we have a building, we have meeting space, we have physical space that we can invite the movement into this space and share it. And a lot of times unions too, there are structural reasons why some of these, bigger organizations will not get involved in mass protests. Well, why? They have formal leadership that can get arrested. They have assets. They have buildings. Sometimes they have people's pension funds. They have a lot of money, but that can be seized by the government, right? So they have enough invested in the system that it makes them hesitant to be a part of a mass protest organization. So we need to understand those type of differences. Well, they're probably not going to lead a civil resistance movement, but they can be good allies, right? And sometimes they can be supportive of things. Maybe they can't officially take it on, but they can fund it or they can support it in different ways. They can provide training, they can provide expertise, right? We write about this in This is an Uprising about how groups that oftentimes start mass revolts are not the groups that you would expect. They're not the best established groups in the country. In the case of Egypt, it wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood with this amazing network of services and organization that starts, that movement during the Arab Spring. It's youth movements, it's more ad hoc movements. Now, in the end, the Muslim Brotherhood ends up with the capacity to absorb a lot of the energy of the movement, maybe in a way that other forces don't like, right? So those different segments of the ecology can be important at different stages of movement cycles. But I guess what we're talking about in thinking ecologically is some of these skills like how to be a good ally, how to absorb the energy. Let's proactively think about absorbing the energy of these big moments, knowing that they don't last forever, right? Knowing that they're temporary. How can we channel that effectively, prolong those moments and channel their power?
Can we a little bit because in addition to this concept of the movements as ecosystems, which I also really find it very, very, very useful. The other thing what I found very useful in your writing is this concept of the movements which are unfolding in a circle or in the phases. Sometimes I have seen that you and your colleagues in Untitled Institute are using movement seasons. So can you just, for somebody who never kind of came across this idea that movements are seasons or circles, let's say, how can you just describe a little bit what are these seasons, what's happening in them, and why they are so important for the good strategizing?
Well, so again, this is something that's very evident and very pronounced in the mass protest sphere, because you do have these cycles where things seem to, where it's subterranean for a long time, it's small groups laboring in obscurity, and then they have breakthrough events that give them a lot of public attention, but that will ultimately die down. And you can prolong that, you can increase the amount of time they're in the public eye, these are brought about by what are called trigger events. So um, trigger events are public events. They can be a war, a natural disaster, a public scandal. It could be the outbreak of coronavirus. It could be, here in the United States around Black Lives Matter, we had like a killing, a police murder of someone that sends people into the streets, right? So there are these trigger events that set off waves of protest. Sometimes there are more there's other triggers. Sometimes those triggers are the repression of protests. Protesters are killed or other people are killed. That sets off another wave of protest. But eventually, you're going to have ups and downs, and it's going to go down again, right? And when it goes down again, you have to be positioned again to regroup, to absorb, to create an infrastructure so that, yes, this has died down, but you're not starting at the same level. You're starting the next wave at a different level in terms of public awareness, in terms of your level of organization, your infrastructure, all of those things, right? You don't want to revert to where you were before. But having an understanding of that up and down cycle is very important because people who have never done this before, never been a part of it before, they get caught up in the euphoria of the high, you know. And then when there is that downturn, it's both the public. The public has that moment of, well, this movement, where is it? It's gone. Didn't do anything, right? So you have this tremendous public cynicism. And for activists themselves, it can be very disillusioning, right? Because there's that feeling of, oh, what happened to all of that energy, all of that excitement? So talking about the cyclical nature, movement cycles and movement seasons is a way of preparing people for that, right? So even during the high, you say, well, this is going to die down, but this is what we need to do when it dies down. This is what we need to think about for how to weather that up and down cycle, right? And so that's a big psychological shift. It's not 100% effective. It's still disillusioning every single time you go through this, right? But that's a psychological shift. And then when you think about this ecologically, when we go back to that pie, those different pieces of the pie have different importance at different moments, right? So that space of alternatives is very important in these, long moments when there's not a lot going on. Those spaces of alternatives, they keep radical ideas alive. They cultivate cadre of committed people who are then prepared when you have your explosive moments. They come back into it and they're prepared with their experience, with their institutional memory, with their values. So that segment of the ecology becomes important in that kind of subterranean period, right? The mass protest is very important during that peak moment, which is the moment of the whirlwind. That's what we talk about. That's a moment that changes political conditions. It makes new things possible. And those people who have those skills in how do we use civil resistance? How do we use strikes and boycotts and protests and sit-ins to amplify that? That piece of the pie becomes very important. Afterward, structure becomes very important because they're the people. How do we absorb this for the long term? How do we take that energy and then you're not going to get everybody. A lot of people are going to fall away. But if we can take even 10% of the people who are involved in the peak moment and absorb them into ongoing activity, structure can do that. And inside game is important because inside game says, well, how do we take the changed political conditions and then actually convert that into public policy, into legislation, into legal victories, into electoral victories, right? So at different moments in that up and down cycle, the different segments of the ecology, the different niches within an ecosystem become more important. So again, part of this is it's analytical, so it improves our understanding of what's going on. It's psychological because it prepares us emotionally to handle, what's going on. But this tends to be uh, very resonant for people who have lived through this, because you can speak to an experience and you can say, you know what, uh, civil rights activists, 60 years ago experienced the exact same thing you're experiencing right now, right? We can look at history and we see patterns, we see patterns. And that can be very powerful for people to understand that. So we're not the first ones by any means to talk about movement cycles or to talk about seasons. There are many frameworks, both academic ones by people like Sidney Tarot and activist ones, people like Bill Moyer, who has this movement action plan, who actually has a graph of the up and down of what this cycle looks like. So, and those are just two examples of many. There are many people who have thought about the cyclical nature of movements, but it can make a very important contribution to be able to understand that, to relate that to history, and then to help movements respond effectively. Because we know, for example, during that period of disappointment after a whirlwind, is oftentimes when people have strategic breakthroughs because they, you know, they have that experience of the euphoria, but the disappointment, and then they're open. It opens them to thinking about doing things differently and integrating other aspects of the ecology and thinking about how they can do their own role better and how they can learn from history. So that actually, even though it's disappointing, can be a very fertile period for movement changers, where you can have great dialogues about these issues.
Imagine that we are now the part of the movement which is kind of the picking up. You feel, let's say, that that the energy is raising, but you have this understanding that you will reach your peak, and then in one moment that it will start to go down. So you want to prevent of your movement fading away. So what should you do then in a moment of the high energy, high participation? What are the concrete things what the movement should do in order to prevent them fading away, but basically reshaping and rechanneling that energy in something what will stay, so that next time they can pick up from the other level?
Igor, you want all the answers. You want the answers. Look, we're having a conversation here for an hour. These are questions certainly that you can do week-long trainings on, not just us, lots of other people, including, like people who are in Opor in Serbia, have created training institutes to walk people through what are ideas and practices. So these are hard discussions that activists and organizers are having all over the world, and they're long discussions. There's not something I can tell you in 5 minutes that's just an easy answer. But sure, you can point to lots of things, right? So there are things about, well, first of all, when you're on the up, we want to maximize that. We want to throw down. And you'd be surprised. A lot of people are not oriented in that moment to maximizing it. Right? Why? Because there's a lot of people in different segments that say, well, that's not our theory of change. That's not our thing. We don't do that. So they won't come in. Even, there are a lot of people who just say, who conceive of themselves as revolutionaries, but then they just say, well, that's not it. That's not the revolution. The revolution never comes. The right moment never comes, So orienting people to understanding some of these basic concepts. What is a trigger event? Why is it important? What the public response is. Why is it the timing of it important to get in there and make interventions into that mass protest space at that key moment, right? So getting people to think about that, those things are very important. What are the media strategies, right? Because now you're dealing with polarization. So mass protests are very polarizing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In the United States, you say that to someone, people think that's bad. But the alternative, Ezra Klein, a New York Times commentator, has a book about polarization. And he says the alternative to polarization is not unity, it's not agreement. The alternative to polarization is denial. It's just not acknowledging something, right? So like in the civil rights movement, well, there's massive injustice. You had the injustice of apartheid, but politicians just didn't want to touch it, right? So then when you force them to touch it, it's polarizing because they have to take a side, one side or another, right? And people are uncomfortable with that. So you have to think about, well, what's the dynamics of polarization? If you're doing actions, protests that force people to be on one side or the other, then you have to talk about, well, what do we do to make sure more people go to our side than go to the other side, right? And so there's lots of tools and things that you can think of how to use polarization effectively, right? So that's a whole nother conversation. That's a whole nother workshop. That's a whole nother article, that we're going to write about, So there's those type of skills of how do we respond in this moment. But then there's also, well, um, what are the mechanisms for handling this influx of people? And so that's where you get into something like mass training. What is a mass
Mm.
training program? How does it look? How do you create decentralized mass training programs? Meaning that you can train trainers who can in turn go out and run their own trainings, right? Um, that's very different than what a lot of organizations are used to, where there becomes a bottleneck because they only have a small amount of staff. You can't hire that many people to do trainings, right? So these technologies of decentralized or distributed organizing, where you're always oriented to training new people who can go out to train new people and creating systems that retain a high level of skill and integrity, right? If we say we need a training program that's rigorous, right? How do you maintain the quality of that while also achieving scale, right? So that's what the whole dialogue of mass training is. How do we create these training programs that are scalable and that allow people to go out? That's an extremely important conversation. And there are masters
Mm.
of that craft out in this world who really know how to run mass training programs and have experience doing that in a very impressive way, but it's very challenging. Then you deal with absorption. How do you absorb people into structures so that when the momentum declines, you've captured them in some way? Not everybody, but and again, there's a whole theories and practical methodologies and ways of going about doing that. It's not a short conversation, but it's important to just be understand that that's the challenge we're even talking about. And
Mm.
sometimes it's very complicated, but sometimes it's not. There was an organizer here during the global justice movement during Seattle. His name was Trim Bissell. And every big protest, he just walked around with a clipboard. Okay. And he said, I have a local network of anti-sweatshop activists that's nationwide. And I've got groups, whatever state you're in, I've got a group of anti-sweatshop activists who are going to run a campaign. So you're here right now at a big protest against the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, but sign up and I'll put you in the local group. That's all he did.
Mm.
That was the technology. It was a clipboard, literally.
Mm.
Every protest, he was out there walking around with that, right? And everyone who complained, you had all sorts of people. Now they do it on the internet, but who would complain like, "Oh, these people are just going to go home. The mass protest isn't doing anything." And I'm like, Trim Bissell just signed up 75 people to be a part of his network.
Now, let's go a little bit to think about building broad alliances. You argue we need bigger and more coordinated movements nowadays than ever before, and I do agree. You also say we need to achieve a greater level of the scale and the ambition, but we can do it only if we build a big V. And that is a challenge. And the challenge is probably that we do the many mistakes because we remain and keep us too narrow. On the other side, it's not easy to reach out over many let's say polarizing divisions. So can you a little bit share how you think how we can broaden the alliance and why it is so important?
So, mass protests in particular need to be oriented toward bringing in more and more people, broader and broader swaths of society. And that's measured by active support and passive support. So your active support is the number of people who are in your movement, who are showing up for protests, who give you money, who vote the way you want them to vote, who are part of your parties, whatever it is. Those are active supporters. Passive supporters are people who support your issue. If you say, what do you think about what do you think about same-sex marriage? What do you think about gun control? What do you think about whatever issue it is that you're fighting around? Your passive supporters are a much broader pool of people, but you need to be growing that. You need to be growing your passive support. Passive support, they might not like what the movement is doing because what the movement is doing is polarizing. So if you ask them about, oh, this movement that's like blocking traffic and making it difficult for me to go to work, they will say, we don't like it, you know. And that's true of in American history. That's true of events like in the civil rights movement, like people like Martin Luther King, who are now considered national heroes. At the time, people did not like it. He was a very polarizing figure, and there's great historical data on this and polling and things like the lunch counter sit-ins in the South. Things again that now are part of American history as great moments of patriotic service to the country and to the service of justice. They were very unpopular, but they got people to say, even if they said, I don't like the movement, I don't like that tactic, I agree with that they have a point. I agree with their cause. And one of Martin Luther King's most famous and powerful essays is about this. It's called The Letter from the Birmingham City Jail in 1963, where everyone's coming at him saying, why do you have to be so divisive? We agree with you. We agree with your point, but why do you have to be polarized and divisive? And King explains why, explains why this works, so go read it if you haven't already. Many people probably have, but it's a great essay. So, but you need to be oriented toward growing your movement and growing your active support and growing your passive support. Okay, now that seems totally obvious, right? It's not totally obvious because and that's again, you get back to theories of change, because there are theories of change that are based on what we call the myth of the righteous few, right? It's that if we have the most disciplined people with the best political analysis, right? And everyone agrees on the correct line that that's what's going to win, right? And that results in this intense self-isolation and fragmentation, schisms, where you get smaller and smaller groups that are purer and purer, have purer and purer politics, right? And there are a lot of organizers who are oriented toward that. And within the field of alternatives, that's very important because you're trying to distinguish yourself from the mainstream. You're trying to create a world with different values and a different in-group. And being part of that in-group can be very powerful, right? Because it creates a space that's distinguished from mainstream society. And that's part of what your theory of change is doing, is creating a very pure vision of what a different world can look like. And so you have to police those borders of who's in and who's out. Mass movements can't do that, right? Mass movements always have to be looking to expanding and winning over more people. So first of all, it's just having that as a goal, building a bigger we, and making that explicit as part of what you're doing is very important. Okay. And a lot of people won't. And a lot of times it comes up as a conflict. So in Occupy Wall Street, there was a slogan, the 99% versus the 1%, right? So that's a very populist bit, that's saying that's a big we, the 99%. We are the 99%. And there were people who didn't like that. They did not like that slogan, right? They wanted to just make all sorts of distinctions. They had ultimately a vision of a much smaller and more pure movement that slogan of the 99% versus the 1% did not accommodate. But that was important because this is what we call movements have DNA, whether you intentionally create that or not, right? Those are a part of movement. So sometimes that's like the first thing that a movement does. So in the case of some of the Indignados movements or Occupy Wall Street, the tactical DNA was occupying a public square, right? And so that got replicated again and again and again, which is good. There's a lot of strengths to that tactic, but the problem is it created a tactical rigidity where people were so obsessed with doing an occupation in a public square that the moment that occupation got evicted or disrupted, it was like the end of the movement, right? Which is ridiculous. There's no reason why that needs to be. That was just a tactic. That doesn't have to be the identity of the movement, but because it was baked into it, that became part of the movement's DNA. So in that case, the slogan "We are the 99%" was an effective part of the DNA because it oriented toward people to building bigger and bigger movements. So part of it, that's half the challenge, is just saying like this is actually what we're trying to do. We're trying to build. Another idea that's gotten a lot of currency is the 3.5%. Are you familiar with that? 3.5% is a number from Erica Chenoweth, who's a theorist of civil resistance, that says that she had a study of movements to overthrow regimes, and she said that any movement that gets 3.5% active support historically has won, right? Now that's an important number because it does make that distinction between active and passive support, right? You don't necessarily need 50%. You need 50% passive supporters. But in terms of the people on the street, even having 3%, 4%. That's a very powerful idea. Now, some people fixate on that number in a way that's not helpful, so that number can be inspiring or it can be limiting if depending on how people receive it. But that's another idea that has been useful in talking about some of these concepts. But in the United States, getting 3.5% is getting 12 million people on the street, getting 15 million people on the street, right? And that's very useful because it gets people thinking about, well, yeah, that's a big number, right? That's a lot of people. We need protests with millions. We can't be content with having an organization of 100 people here and 100 people there, right? So it orients people toward that building a bigger we, and then good organizers have to think about that in all sorts of different ways. What are our core demands? What are our core values that we cannot compromise on that we can orient people around? And what are other things where we accept that maybe people will have different views about, that they won't be united on this idea, but we can build bridges across that difference. Maybe in the long term, we can win people over on some of those issues, but we're going to meet people where they're at, and we're going to try to win them over to our cause, right? That's something that people in alternatives are often not willing to do. They're not willing to take someone who might agree with them on one point, but disagrees with something else that seems to violate their values and try to win that person over time, So it's a different type of orientation in your organizing. Now, that can be easy if it's kind of a regime type situation where you're trying to overthrow a very hated government, right? That can be a very unifying thing. You can build a very broad base of people who are unified around overthrowing that government, right? Because everyone hates, everyone hates the leader. And so you can have lots of differences in that coalition, but you have a unified movement around that goal, right? And then what happens a lot of times is they win, and then that coalition immediately fragments, right? Because everyone agreed on that, but on what comes next, they don't agree, So then you have a whole nother wave of political struggle that is about figuring out, well, what comes next after this regime. And sometimes that goes well, other times it does not go well. And you end up with other people taking over who you also do not like, So that can happen. But, thinking about what are widely held values and what are demands that bring together, that create that broader we, thinking about meeting people where they're at and then, having core areas of agreement and then trying to move people from one place to another. All of those are important values when you're thinking about movements that have scale and reach. And they're different than in some of the other theories of change where you want smaller, purer movements.
Let me just kind of touch three more things. Let's say one is, many movements today describe themselves as a leaderless, as a horizontal, as a spontaneous. Particularly kind of the youth, Gen Z movements use this kind of language. Oh, we are leaderless. I personally find that I would even say suicidal, as sometimes. And all my experiences, no, we don't need maybe hierarchies or strict hierarchies, but we need leaderful movements. And this concept of the leaderless is in a certain way very, very damaging. So what is your thinking about that?
Well, so, you have to historically contextualize this a little bit. This was a trend that certainly has been the case in the US. There was maybe a 30 some year period starting in the 1980s. Certainly it was true in the anti-globalization movement. There were major moves true in Occupy Wall Street where there was essentially an anarchist politics that really carried the day. And that had a number of biases. It was very suspicious of formal leadership. It was very suspicious of political parties, considered all political parties as, kind of the same corrupt system, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those biases, there were things that came out of that political culture that they actually did very well. There were strengths to that political tradition. For example, when you talk about the use of art and creativity, there was great theater and things that came out of that. When you talk about the control of physical space, there's all sorts of theories like temporary autonomous zones that are about what is the liberatory potential of taking over a public space, and how do you use that space in a liberatory way that's very exciting. And those are advances that, a lot of times the labor movement, I've been to thousands of very boring protests, you know, where you show up and they don't know actually what to do with people to create
Mhm.
excitement and energy and spirit that's going to animate a wider movement. So there's a lot that came out of the anarchist tradition that was good. But, and, the idea of leaderless movements, I mean, this can go back earlier than the 80s. This can go back to the New Left and a suspicion of formal leadership, and we could trace lots of reasons for this and lineages of this, but certainly there's a fairly long history of distrust for formal leadership. And again, another advantage of that is it's a response to repression, right? That if the formal leader can just be assassinated or arrested or whatever, then sometimes having a more horizontal structure where there's not just an individual where they can chop off the head, that can be an advantage. That said, there are major liabilities to this. The idea of the spontaneous, totally horizontal structure can be harmful in many ways. So first of all is what's called the tyranny of structurelessness. There's a famous essay by a feminist writer in the 70s named Jo Freeman, who argues that there are always leadership structures at play. It's just a question of whether you're formally acknowledging them or not. And when you don't formally acknowledge them, it has all sorts of consequences, in terms of how leadership actually and power actually gets exercised in a movement. It affects things like the media is able to choose your leaders for you because they just select spokespeople. So if you don't select your spokespeople, the media selects them for you, and that can be a big liability for movements. There's lots of problems with that tyranny of structurelessness, and I think increasingly in the last 10 years or so, people have recognized this. So I think that anarchist ethos, certainly from my perspective, has diminished in the last 10 to 15 years, where I think people are now in the US, they're more interested in doing critical interventions into electoral politics. They're more willing to have some recognition of leadership, even in a qualified way. And things like words that you just used, leaderful. We're going to have leaderful movements. Well, what does that mean? Well, instead of saying leaderless, which evinces this distrust of leadership, we're going to have a lot of leadership at different levels, and we're going to talk about why it's important for people to step into leadership. We're going to talk about how we value and honor our leaders at different levels. We're going to be more transparent about what are the ladders of leadership that you can move into, and people respond to that. Like, part of the problem with leadership is when it doesn't feel transparent and it doesn't feel accountable, so then people don't know why this person becomes a leader, and is it just because the media decided or because they have a big social media following or something like that, versus legitimate mechanisms of leadership. So I think that leadership is very important. I think part, again, of doing this better and reflecting on what's happened in the last 20 years is saying there are some real limits to purely horizontal organizing. There's a famous book by Vincent Bevins that came out a few years ago called If We Burn that talks about limits of horizontalism. And I agree with that critique. I think it's good. I think that, a lot of the models that we look at are what are called distributed models, so there is leadership, but it's widely distributed, and it allows structures to be replicated. So maybe there isn't a single hierarchical, organization with a single leader, but there are mechanisms for how do we create scalable structures where people can step into leadership. We're recognizing the importance of that, but at the same time, it's not just one leader where they can cut the head off the movement and it's over.